Appreciate everybody being here tonight. It is spring break, so our numbers are a little low. But just think how much lower it would be if we didn't have a celebrity with us tonight. We have Andrew Kingsley, one of our own. Andrew, we claim you. Andrew, for those of you who are newer to the congregation, Andrew was a youth minister here for 5 years, and I really enjoyed working with Andrew, and been enjoying continuing our relationship as he has been down in Montgomery for 7 years now at the University Church and also teaching at Faulkner University. Andrew has just recently completed his work for a PhD. His wife, Kana, is teaching in the PT school at Faulkner, is a big part of getting that school started over there. And he has 3 children. His oldest, Kendall, is with us somewhere tonight, probably in class. And she's a sweet little girl and been helping her daddy today. And so it's been good to be able to hang out with them a little bit. Andrew, as you know, is a capable speaker, very talented, very intelligent man. And we're so excited that he's with us tonight. Our theme is tests of the Bible. And his test comes from Luke 22. It's about Peter. And the title of the lesson is Satan's Sifter, the Test of Shame.
Thank you, Drew. Listen, anytime I get kind of depressed or down on myself, I'm going to just ask you to give me an introduction, and then I'll feel much better about every decision I've ever made in life. So thank you, Drew. I appreciate that. As always, I wish I could find the words, and I think about this every time I drive up here to be able to either just speak or visit. I wish I could find the words to express to you guys how grateful I am for this church. Love this church, love these people. Thank you so much for being such a big part of not just my life, but the lives of my family. Thrilled that Kendall is able to be up here. I think she's somewhere with Jenna right now, maybe helping. Hopefully she's actually helping and not contributing to the chaos in whatever class she's helping with. But we got to ride through. I took her through where we used to live here in town, just talked and got to reminisce about some of our best years here in Leeds, but it's not the location, obviously, that makes it. It's the people at this church. So I am forever grateful to you and definitely honored to be considered one of the group here at Asheville Road. And before I get into this, I will say I do appreciate Eli for having the guts to do something I would have never had the guts to do. If you're not aware, all of the teenagers' cell phones are in a bucket up here on the front row. So Eli, I mean, that is mad respect all the way across for that, and good on you teenagers for actually like buying into that. That's awesome. Not sure I could have ever accomplished that. So a lot of exciting things definitely here, and you guys are constantly in our prayers. We love each and every one of you. And as much as I'd love to stand up here and reminisce all night, because I certainly could and would enjoy that, that's not why I'm here. Luke 22, and I've got this, really, I think, the continuation of what Drew read for us a moment ago, where Jesus turns to Peter, and this is, right after they're in the upper room where Jesus washes their feet. He says, one of you is going to betray me. He turns to Peter at one point, and he says to him, Simon, Simon, Satan demanded to have you, to sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail, and when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. And there's a lot loaded into that. But I want to sort of track the story and see if we can't observe that sifting as it happens in the text. So if we sort of leave Peter's story there for a moment, I want to jump ahead to a scene just a couple scenes later in the Gospel of Luke. And I want to start here in verse 54. And what I want to do for the time we have now is read 54 to 62, and then we're going to have some discussion about it. And hopefully, by the end of our discussion tonight, you'll see the ways in which Peter's faith was shaken. And the word here that's used is sifted, but I would imagine most of us here tonight, I don't want to insult anybody's intelligence, not because we don't know what it means to sift something, but you probably do. Sifting is just, you have some kind of grate or something with small openings, and you just kind of shake it out, and the stuff you don't want falls out, the stuff you do want stays in, right? So when Satan demands to have not just Peter, but we'll also see the rest of the apostles as well, He demands to have all of them so he can shake them, so he can try to essentially topple their faith and ruin the connection that they have, not, well, just to Jesus as their earthly rabbi and that idea they might have of Jesus as the Jewish Messiah in a very earthly sense, but he's trying to shake them loose even of their trust and confidence in God himself. So as we move through this tonight, I would imagine maybe many of us have been in some kind of similar situation. And I know none of us have been in the exact situation that Peter is in here, but I would imagine as we go through this story of Peter, at least for me in my study leading up to our discussion tonight, maybe in some uncomfortable ways or in ways that were maybe a little more similar to some of our experience than we would like to admit, we can recognize some of the sifting that Peter goes through here. But the next touch point I want to pick up on starts here in verse 54. Then they seized him. So that's the crowd that comes led by Judas. You know, that's got some officers from the chief priests, officers from the Pharisees, and then obviously Judas himself. That's the group here that's described as they. So they seize Jesus and they lead him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. And now notice this next phrase. It'll be important in a minute. And Peter was following at a distance. And when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat down among them. Then a servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the light and looking closely at him, said, "This man also was with him." But he denied it, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." And a little later, someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." And after an interval of about an hour, still another insisted, saying, "Certainly this man also was with him, for he too is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are talking about." And immediately while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he said to him, "Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. And I think we can recognize at least, or as we reflect together on the text tonight, I think we'll see how Peter is shaken or sifted in at least 3 or 4 different ways from our discussion here tonight. But let's start here at the beginning of this section in verse 54. So this group takes Jesus and they lead him away. And notice what's said about Peter at the end of verse 54. Peter is following at a distance. Now, obviously, Luke is not trying, it doesn't look like anyway, he's trying to make some spiritual statement about Peter's relationship to Jesus at the time. He's just trying to tell you, Peter's kind of hanging around to see what happens, so he follows at a distance, but he's not in the middle of the issue. But I think as we look at some of these things in detail, we'll find out not only is this a good description of where he is physically in relation to Jesus, it's a pretty good description of where he might be spiritually, or at least where he might be in his faith that Jesus is the Messiah. So I'm not sure if you have ever had this experience. This is a very familiar passage of Scripture, I would imagine, to all of us. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of wondering how it is Peter can go from that scene in the Garden of Gethsemane to where he is now. So let's just put ourselves in the shoes of Peter here. If we're trying to picture this scene, it's the night of his betrayal. It's sometime not too far removed from the time of year that we're in right now. It actually would have been a pretty similar time of year. Now, the climate over there at night, apparently, at least according to the books I've read, I don't know, I've never been over there. So if you've been, I guess you can inform me better. But at least from the things I've seen, the temperature at night will get into low 50s, high 40s, somewhere around there. So it's kind of cold. They had been out in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus is telling them some things they really don't understand about how he's going to go away. He's going to send them a helper and all kinds of things. So a lot of things are probably running through Peter's head. Peter might also remember that Jesus said, "Look, you think you're going to die for me, but I can tell you in just a few hours, before this night is over, you're going to deny me 3 times. Well, what happens in the Garden of Gethsemane? And I think a lot of times we jump from the passage we just read to the one that we're going to now, but we skip what's going through Peter's mind as he follows at a distance. What's happened immediately before this? Well, they go into the garden. Jesus says, "Wait here, watch and pray so you may not enter into temptation." What's he do? He falls asleep. And he does that a few times. Jesus goes away to pray 3 times. Peter and John can't hang. They can't stay awake. They keep falling asleep. Well, then Judas shows up to take Jesus. And do you remember how Peter responds there? I mean, this is one of the stories as a kid I know I immediately latched onto because there was a sword and there was some kind of action involved. So I've never forgotten this. You remember what happens, right? They try to take Jesus, and we don't have all the details here. We can speculate some, but it really doesn't do us much good. We don't have all the details, but whatever happens, Peter is not scared. Peter is not afraid to be numbered with Jesus in the garden, is he? In fact, he's so unafraid that he's willing to draw his sword and go to war. Peter's actually willing to die just moments before this in the garden. Now, he might not have thought he was actually going to die, because remember what he believes about Jesus. He thinks Jesus is the Messiah. The Messiah doesn't lose. The Messiah doesn't die. The Messiah does not get arrested. The Messiah does that to everybody else. The Messiah is the one who's like King David. You can't touch him. He has the authority. He has the power. He has the strength. So maybe Peter has this impression that whatever happens, maybe this is the time now. We're here in the garden. Here they come to take him. Now's the time to act. Now we can finally bring the kingdom of Israel, and I get to do my part in this. Here we go, I'm ready to fight. And so he pulls out his sword, and you know what he does? He cuts off the ear of one of the servants of the high priest that we find out later. His name is Malchus. He reaches out his sword and he cuts off his ear. And we were talking about this at dinner before we came over here. And I want you to picture the scenarios in which somebody gets their ear cut off with a sword. So if you are getting your ear cut off by somebody with a sword, the person that has cut your ear off is either just incredibly skilled and talented to where they can swing a sword at you and the only thing they can hit is your ear. More likely, they're trying to kill you. And you've either just dodged out of the way or there was some kind of struggle, sword slips, your ear goes off. Peter's doesn't look like he's just threatening here. He is ready to go to war. He is ready to kill. He is not afraid of anything. And then what happens? Remember what Jesus says to him? He just says, enough of this in Luke. He says, stop. We're not going to do this. And he turns himself in. Everybody else flees, but Peter and John follow at a distance. So that distance from just outside of Jerusalem, like a little bit to the east, not very far at all, that distance where Peter and John are walking together, sort of, I would imagine, hanging out far enough behind the crowd to avoid being seen. What on earth is going through their minds? I mean, what might be going through your mind? If you had followed a man around for 3 years thinking that he was going to be the next king of Israel, and we're not thinking in terms of just a spiritual king, we're thinking of an actual political king who's going to sit on the actual throne of the kingdom of Israel just like David did, and we're going to take over Rome. Rome can't touch us anymore, and we're going to take over anybody else that wants to mess with us, and I get to be one of the right-hand dudes in the next kingdom that's on the way. That's my impression, and when I feel like it's go time, the Messiah, the Christ, has said, no, and he turns himself in. What is that going to do then to my confidence that this man really is the Messiah? Now, we have very much on our minds the passage that Drew just read for us a moment ago, that Satan has demanded to sift not just Peter, but the rest of the apostles as well, to sift them like wheat, and you're going to deny me 3 times before the rooster crows. Peter, it looks like, though, whatever else is happening, he's forgotten all about that conversation. Because you'll notice he doesn't remember that conversation with Jesus until he actually makes eye contact with him. And you would think maybe after the first time he denies Jesus, he would remember. It would jog his memory. And in fact, if you go look in the Gospel of Mark, you find out that Jesus didn't just say before the rooster crows, he says before the rooster crows 2 times. You will deny me 3 times. If we have more time, we'd spend some time in Mark as well. But as Mark records it, after Peter rejects Jesus the first time, guess what he hears? The first crow of the rooster. Guess what he does not do? Remember the prediction that Jesus made. So we don't want to speculate too much, but whatever the case is, we can recognize that Peter's definitely shaken. And he's shaken pretty deep down, not even enough to remember a conversation that happened just a few hours ago because of the events that had happened that evening. So he's traveling at a distance with these things in his mind. I would imagine at least the sifting begins here with the fact that Peter's faith is shaken, or at least he's been destabilized in his belief that Jesus is the Son of God. And I wonder if you haven't had some kind of experience in your life where you can recognize some major problem that happened or some major mistake that I have made in my life. Where did that start? Did it start with just I made one bad decision in one moment? And a lot of times, yeah, that's all it was. Just poor judgment, made a mistake. But if we're honest with ourselves, I wonder how many times something that might even seem like a small problem is actually just a symptom of the fact that something has happened to shake my faith. Now, I'm not really sure that Jesus is actually the Son of God. I'm not actually sure if there is a God. And so these things I am not really sure about that He's commanded me to do. So He's commanded me to do a bunch of things. He's commanded me not to do a bunch of things, to have life according to His ways. But if I'm not really certain that He's even there, or if I'm not really certain that His way is actually the best way, then I think you can see we open ourselves up to make some pretty big mistakes. Things that we might think are just innocent and poor judgment might have a little more of something behind them. The tricks that Satan uses to deceive all throughout Scripture are not just tricks he uses in the moment. Satan's nature does not change throughout Scripture. When he's introduced in Genesis chapter 1, how is he introduced? Genesis chapter 3, how is he introduced? Genesis chapter 3, he's introduced as the most crafty or the most cunning of the beasts of the field. You can read in Ephesians that you're supposed to be standing against the wily schemes of the devil. He's very intelligent, and his primary goal to trip people up is deceit. What better place to start with Peter than by shaking his confidence in the fact either that Jesus really is the Christ, or that two, that Jesus is doing this the right way. That Jesus, maybe He really is the Christ, but He shouldn't have turned Himself over. He should have let me fight. We could have handled it. I mean, there were 12 of us. He's the Messiah. God's on our side. We're ready to go. I know all these stories about Gideon with just a tiny group of 300 people wiping out an entire army. I know that God can save by little or by few, just like Jonathan did. So we're ready to go, and He told us to stop. Certainly we can imagine that his faith was shaken. And I want to notice something just quickly here about this sifting. So we've mentioned this a few times, but if we read back in chapter 22, starting in verse 31 that Drew read for us a moment ago, when he turns to Simon, the picture here is one of Jesus speaking to all of the apostles together. Presumably, obviously, Judas is gone by this point. So he's got 11 of them. And he's speaking to all of them, and then he turns his attention to Simon. Now, he could have pulled him aside, and it's a private conversation as they're walking together. So this scene happens after that upper room where Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper, and He washes their feet. As they leave from there, and they're walking out to the city, or walking out of the city to the Mount of Olives, Garden of Gethsemane is at the base of that mountain. As they're walking, Jesus is teaching them, He's speaking to them. It might be that He's addressing Simon in front of everybody. It might be that He's pulled him to the side. But whatever the case is, when He says, Simon, Simon, Satan demanded to have you, that you in Greek is plural. So probably a more accurate translation in English would be you all. Satan demanded to have all of you. He demanded to have all of the 12 so that he can sift all 12 of you like wheat. So this isn't a sifting that's just for Peter. It's in fact for all of them. And you can see that, well, they're all going to turn and fall away, but then what Jesus says next is telling and probably informs the way that Peter responds. He says, but when you have turned back, Now, when he says you that time, it's singular. So he says, Satan demanded to have all of you guys, but Peter, when you mess up and you turn away, after you come back, I have prayed for you so that you can come back and restore and strengthen up your brothers. So what Peter hears is everybody's going to be sifted and I am going to fail. And so Peter says, no, I'm not. I'll go to prison and I will go to death for you. And he proves that in the garden, that he is legitimately ready to go to jail or worse for the sake of Christ. And what holds him back is the words of Jesus himself. So again, Peter is definitely at a distance physically, but I don't think it's too much of a stretch to at least observe that Peter is certainly at a distance in terms of his relationship, or at least in terms of his faith in Jesus as the Messiah. And as we follow through the sifting here and see how this continues to lead to further and further issue for Peter, considering, all right, well, if I were to describe my relationship with Jesus tonight, do I feel like I'm following him closely? I mean, what are Peter's other options here before we beat up on him too bad for following at a distance? I mean, what are his other options? I mean, I guess he could have jumped right in and tried to resist, and then he'd be breaking the command that Jesus gave him, right? But at the very least, maybe he could be a little less, shy, or maybe not so much lurking in the shadows, maybe a little more present in his following of Jesus. But at least where I'm sitting here tonight, I do have to wonder, if someone was going to describe where I am in relation to Jesus tonight, would they describe me as following at a distance? Or would they describe me as right there with him in the garden? And you notice how quickly Peter goes from right there with him in the garden, ready to die, to following at a distance. And if Peter can so quickly be shaken in his faith, I think we might be a little arrogant tonight to assume that the same cannot happen to us through whatever circumstances life might throw at us. One more thing to mention here, though, before I move on, probably. Okay, yeah, there we go. One more thing to mention here. The last thing that's put in bold at the end, and Peter sat down among them. Again, I don't think Luke is trying to make any statement about Peter's spiritual status at the moment. But as we've read through this section a moment ago, whose side is Peter on in the courtyard of the house of the high priest? Whose side is he on? You notice that language of like us versus them throughout the conversations that they have? You have the servant girl who here twice is going to say, here once, and I believe it's in Mark where the servant girl actually repeats up twice and says this, and in John as well. But either way, there's several people talking, and on three main occasions, Peter has the opportunity to stand up for Christ again, just like he did in the garden. And we know how that goes here. But when they speak to Peter, they all say, were you not also with him, or are you not one of them? And who does Peter side with? Well, Peter sides with the group that's sitting around the fire. And I would invite you to, again, at the beginning of verse 54 up there on the screen, the people he is sitting with, and you might be familiar with this from, I believe it's John's account, that will tell you that one of the people that saw him said, I recognize you because I saw you in the garden. And he's actually a relative of Malchus. He's a family member of the guy that got his ear chopped off, who's presumably getting medical attention at this time. I don't know. People back then were pretty tough, so maybe he's not. Maybe he's just fine. But either way, as Peter is sitting there by the fire warming himself, sitting right next to him is very likely the same people that just arrested Jesus minutes before. The same people that Peter was trying to kill just a few moments ago, Peter's now sitting down next to, warming himself by the fire, claiming, I don't know this man. I don't know him. Yes, you do. You're a Galilean, obviously, probably from his accent. You're a Galilean, and didn't we see you in the garden? I mean, you actually tried to kill somebody. We saw that. No. Wasn't me. So he sits down among them physically, obviously. We don't want to draw too much here. But certainly we can at least reflect on this and say, Peter is definitely counting himself among their ranks at this point. So in the first place, we can observe that Peter's faith is shaken, or he's destabilized, or whatever vocabulary you have to illustrate the fact that Peter's certainly shaken in his faith here. So he's not balanced. And then comes this public challenge to his faith. And I guess you could argue all of it's a challenge. But here he's very much challenged to actually act. How the servant girl recognized him, we don't know. But I do want you to notice what she says to him. She looks very closely at him in the light, and you can picture this scene where it's very dark outside. You got a little bit of light coming from the fire here in the courtyard. The high priest house, probably a very nice structure. So you've got the main house here, probably maybe even some wings off to the side with maybe like a porch on the front, or maybe even some of the house in the front. But either way, there's the outdoor courtyard in the middle of all this complex of the large house. So there's probably a good bit of light, but lots of shadows because it's still dark. It's probably the very early morning hours because of what we know is about to happen. The sun's probably going to rise-ish in about an hour or so, give or take, by the time they arrive. So it's early morning, middle of the night, whatever your perspective is, and the servant girl sees him walk in. Now, the Gospel of John is pretty interesting here, so let's actually go look at this. If we go to the Gospel of John and look at the account that John gives you here, you're going to get several more details about this little trip that they take from the Garden of Gethsemane over to the house of the high priest. So I'm in John chapter 18 now, and I want to start in verse 15. And by the way, in case you're wondering, all four of the Gospels include this episode of Peter's denial, the prediction, and then what happens subsequently. But in in John's account here, here's what happened. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That other disciple, by the way, is the same who writes the Gospel of John, at least from the best we can tell. So it's probably Peter and John, which checks out with a lot of other things we know about these two from Scripture. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. So picture this. John and Peter are following at a distance. They both arrive. Peter kind of hangs back, but John is known to the high priest, and so John is allowed into the house. Now, under what pretense, we don't know. We don't know if he's allowed into the house with everybody knowing that John is a follower of Jesus or not. But Peter gets in because John gets him in. So Peter stands outside waiting at the door in verse 16. So the other disciple who is known to the high priest, John, goes out and he speaks to the servant girl who kept watch at the door. And so basically go ahead and let Peter come in. So the words you're seeing on the screen now, if you want to flip from what you're looking at in John 18 in front of you to Luke 22 on the screen, does anything seem out of place to you about what the young girl asked him or what the servant girl says? This man also was with him. And so you got a few options here. It could be that she knows that John was with him and that John shows up. And so John is, he's not denying here. John's everything is on the table. We all know that John's here. And so when Peter shows up, he would at least have some support, likely, in the fact that John is known to the high priest, presumably known to everybody. But it could also just as likely be that everybody in the courtyard is talking about Jesus and his followers, and they see him and say, oh yeah, you're one of those guys. You were also with him. So we don't want to stretch it too far either way, but at the very least, we know John is there, and he has John with him. That's not recorded here in Luke, but John seems to be closer on into the house while Peter is outside waiting for the verdict, waiting to hear what happens with his trial. And so this servant girl says, weren't you also with him? And so now let's again try to put ourselves in Peter's shoes. Peter, what I would expect Peter to do here, if I can just imagine that I'm reading Luke for the first time, what do I expect Peter to do? Well, really, the main thing I know about Peter so far is that he's a little brash, right, or a little rash, a little bold, and a lot of times he puts his foot in his mouth and says some things he shouldn't say, and he seems like he's pretty aggressive, doesn't he? Throughout the things that he says, like he's ready to go pretty much, and that was confirmed in what we just read in Gethsemane. The last thing I saw Peter doing was try to kill a guy in Luke 22. So if a little servant girl, not a soldier, if a little servant girl comes up to him and says, "What? Aren't you ones that follow Jesus?" I expect Peter to say something that's going to get him in trouble. That's what I would expect. That would be on brand for Peter. But that's not what Peter does. Peter is now challenged by a servant girl. I don't know him. Is it confusing to anybody else or just me that minutes before this, likely within the same hour, Peter's ready to die in the garden, but he's not even willing to confess in the courtyard? How does that happen so quickly? Satan is sifting him. Satan is shaking him. And I wonder in what ways in our lives, where one night we can be here on a Wednesday night and we just feel like we are the most genuine we have ever been in our lives about following Jesus and about standing up for Him. We might really be ready to go to war for Jesus. And then before we even go to sleep tonight, we can't confess Him. Just as Satan sifted and shook the faith of all the apostles, chiefly here seeming Peter, Satan continues to work, prowling as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour today, which is not intended to leave us here tonight just sort of shaking and cowering as we walk out of here, but an encouragement for honest reflection. Am I with Jesus in the garden tonight? Am I following Him at a distance? Or am I already denying Him in the garden? And he makes his choice here. And he denies that he knows Jesus. And there are to me, some faint echoes of the story of Job here. So if we go back to the story of Job, do you remember how that conversation goes between Satan and God at the beginning of Job? God says to him, "Have you considered my servant Job?" Do you remember how Satan responds both times? He says, well, of course he follows you now. I mean, you put a hedge around him. But you take away that hedge, he'll curse you. Job doesn't. And then God says, "You consider my servant Job." Job says, well, yeah, skin for skin, but anything a man has, he will give for his life. If you let me touch him, he'll curse you. When Satan demands to have the apostles, and in some ways our minds, I think, are naturally drawn back to that interchange between God and Satan, where Jesus says, look, Satan demanded to us, he demanded to me that he should have all of you so that he can sift you and shake you. And sure, Peter believes in you now because he's seen you work miracles and he thinks you're going to overthrow Rome. But if you shake his faith, if you shake his confidence in that perception of who you are as Jesus, if you allow yourself to be arrested, he's going to leave you. Peter is being sifted, and he makes the decision here to deny Jesus. And maybe, look, he might be caught off guard. He might be concerned for his safety. Might even be concerned for the safety of Jesus at this point. Could certainly just be self-preservation. But we can see what continues to happen. Just a short time later, someone else asks him the same thing, and Peter makes the same conscious decision. So in the first chance, maybe we say, okay, it's just a fluke, it's poor judgment, he shouldn't have done it. Given the same opportunity again, and I would imagine, does Peter not feel some kind of guilt for what he did? Does he not feel like some kind of failure? The guy that's supposed to be all rough and tough and everything that we've seen so far in the Gospels, ready to fight, and he's made this failure in front of this small group of people. Does he not feel, is he not thinking, is he not feeling something about that in the short time that passes? Whatever happens, though, we're not told in Scripture, presumably for a reason here, but whatever the case is, he makes the exact same decision again. He does it twice. And then even a third time. And these next few words at the beginning of verse 59 can just put a pit in my stomach. After an interval of about an hour. And I don't mean to keep repeating the same thing here tonight, but if you are Peter, what is that hour like for you? You have an hour, and according to the other accounts, at this point, Peter gets up and he goes and he stands by the gate. So he's no longer sitting by the fire because they've already almost got him twice. So he gets up, now he's just kind of leaning against the gate, trying to stay maybe back in the shadows where people can't see him, but it looks like the group keeps talking about him one way or the other for an hour. Over the course of that hour, I would imagine he's running through the events of the last several hours. But whatever happens, he's obviously not aware of the conversation that he had with Jesus just a couple hours ago. And you can see his response in verse 60 here. Man, I don't know what you're talking about. In Matthew and in Mark, this response is much, much stronger. And we're very quickly running out of time, so I wanted to turn over there, but we don't have time to do it. But if you want to go and look in Matthew and in Mark's account, Matthew 26:74, Mark 14:71, what does Peter add to his denial here? He adds something to it. He actually invokes a curse upon himself, and he swears an oath. Now, it says he will swear, he will curse. That doesn't mean he's just using explicit language. It means that he's actually taking an oath, and that he's actually swearing, presumably before possibly even God himself. I'm not lying to you, and if I am lying to you, let me be accursed. I don't know him. I'm not one of them. The mistakes that Peter makes here, one, are so far out of character for who Peter is. But secondly, these mistakes that Peter makes don't just seem to be, I made one bad mistake in one moment. Peter has plenty of time to think about what it is that he is doing. And he very deliberately, so we can't, as much as we might want to come to Peter's defense here tonight, it can be pretty difficult to defend what Peter has done here in denying Christ these 3 times. And immediately while he was still speaking, he hears the rooster crow. And according to Mark, it's the second time he's heard it. So the first time, he's just numb to it. The first time, he doesn't notice. The second time, he hears it. And then whatever the layout of the house is, we don't even have time to talk about it if we wanted to, but you can Google this later. It's pretty interesting. However this happened, somehow the house is structured. Maybe Jesus is even just walking by a window. He's probably bound. Maybe he's walking down one of these hallways where he can see into the courtyard. And as he's being led down the hallway, or if he's just standing in a room, whatever the case is, he makes eye contact with Peter somehow. And that eye contact is enough to do it for Peter. That eye contact is his moment. I would imagine like the closest thing I can think of in Scripture is David's moment with the prophet Nathan, where David hears from Nathan, it's you. The same moment of recognizing his own guilt, and he goes out and he weeps bitterly. We can't really make much mistake about it here. Peter failed, and he failed in a spectacular way. Filled with what must have been crushing guilt and shame, Satan puts Peter through the final stage of his sifting. And I think we'd be tempted to say, well, the sifting is just his opportunity to confess Jesus in the courtyard, but he doesn't do it. So he failed. He was sifted, and he was found wanting, and it was over. But I think a quick comparison to what happens to Judas makes this pretty clear to see. So very famously, Judas, after he betrays Jesus and finds out that they want to kill him, you remember what Judas does? I'm assuming most of us here remember that tonight. If not, we'll jog all of our memories together here. But you remember Judas felt really bad about it. The same kind of crushing guilt and shame that I would imagine Peter feels here. And by the way, those 2 words for wept bitterly, they only show up together twice in the entire New Testament. They just show up here in Luke and then in the other gospel account that mentions this. So the only time those 2 words are used together for weeping and just pure agony is the idea that's brought out. And you could say weeping in agony would be a pretty good translation as well from what I can tell about it. The only time this phrase is used anywhere in Scripture, so Peter is certainly feeling intense agony for what he has done. Judas does as well. Judas regrets what he has done. He even goes back. You remember he gives the money back to them, but they won't take it. They can't put it in the temple because it's blood money. But he just throws it on the floor and he leaves. And you remember what happens to Judas? I think we all remember what happens to Judas. Judas cannot overcome the final stage of his sifting. Judas cannot believe or cannot accept any grace or forgiveness for what he has done. He believes he's too far outside of the grace of God. And look, that's a big debate. If you want to get into, you can ask all your questions to Drew, and he's got all the answers. Could he even repent if he wanted to? All these sorts of things. That's a question for somebody, not me. But you will notice, we'll never know, because Judas gives up on God's grace for him. He gives up on it. Peter, however, does not. And just a beautiful story in the Gospel of John. In John 21, so where John leaves this story, he doesn't mention that Peter went out and wept bitterly. And he leaves a few of these details out. It is funny, though, that he's the only one that actually tells you, yeah, that was Peter that cut off the guys here in the garden. I'm not letting him get away with that. It was Peter. But John's the only one to include this exchange in chapter 21, and you probably already know where we're going with this. You know where he sees, the resurrected Jesus sees Peter. It's the first time Peter has seen him, and can you imagine the emotion that Peter feels? Probably explains why he jumps out of the boat. He's running to him before they ever even make it there. And Jesus asked him 3 times. You already know what he asked him. Do you love me? And the third time he asked him, what's Peter's response? It says his heart is pricked, or he's cut deep down because Jesus asked him the third time. So Peter vividly remembers, and how many times over the last 3 days or several days at this point, it hadn't just been 3 days, it's been many days. How many times do you think Peter has replayed these episodes in the courtyard, or replayed everything that happened that night of Jesus' death? Peter could have been swallowed up by his grief and by his shame. And I've got to believe that this is the final stage of Satan's sifting. I'm going to make him fail, and I'm going to make him fail so miserably that he's going to believe that he is beyond any hope of resolving his relationship with Christ. And sometimes we can do some pretty foolish things ourselves. And I don't know about everybody in here tonight. Maybe we have done some things that we feel like we just flat out don't deserve to be forgiven. Maybe we have had so many things go right for us in our lives. We've had so many opportunities, and we still somehow found a way to one moment feel like we're ready to go to battle for God, and the next moment like, I don't like what he's telling me to do, and we'll do something else. Or I'm going to deny him because I'm too worried about what might happen to me if I say something, or whatever it might be. I don't know if you've ever been in a position in your life where you can relate to Peter, feeling like, what I have done has excluded me from the grace of God. I imagine Paul himself might have felt like that on occasion. He certainly writes in such a way that we could be, I think, pretty safe in assuming that that is true. But I want to take you back to something that Drew read for us a moment ago at the outset of the lesson. And for the sake of time, we're going to have to cut some stuff out here, so bear with me. But in Luke 22, I want to bring your mind to this. Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have all of you, that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you. That you is not plural. He's talking directly to Peter. And he's talking to you too. And to me. 1 John chapter 2, I write these things to you so that you may not sin, but if anybody does sin, he has an advocate with the Father. Peter had an advocate. He prayed for him. You have an advocate here tonight. The same Jesus that prayed for Peter is interceding for you, even right here and now. You are not beyond the grace of God. Whatever spectacular failures you might have in your life, you are not beyond the grace of God. Don't give up on the grace of God too soon. If there's anything that you need, we invite you to come now as we stand and sing together.